trans women are women. Why not?
Because they're men, because they're male.
Dig deeper for me.
If trans women were women, they wouldn't be trans. There's a reason why they're called trans women, and it's because they're not women, they're men. If we allow men to become a subcategory of women, there is no such thing as a woman, because that's the whole point of having definitions of words. The scary thing now is that, maybe 20, 30 years ago, transsexualism, as it used to be called, people were very aware that sex and gender were different. And that's what feminism in the second wave was trying to explain, that yes, we are biologically female, but that shouldn't mean that we should be treated in a way that's different to men in most respects. But now and people would argue that sex and gender are the same, you should be treated because you're that way. But now people have gone back and said, actually, gender and sex are the same, and you can decide what sex you are too, because there's this whole sort of Judith Butler idea that sex isn't real either, and that not just gender is a social construct, but sex is a social construct too. And so now we've started breaking down, the idea is that you can start breaking down what sex means to actually it means nothing. That has serious issues for policy and women's rights. So in that sense, males, which I think are men, can never be women. And so trans women are not women, they're men.
What would you say to the pushback from someone that does believe in trans ideology when they say the genitals aren't indicative of your gender at all, and what's more important is that you feel like a woman, so therefore you are a woman?
Well, if feeling like a woman is what makes you a woman, I don't know what it feels like to be a woman. I just am one. When you ask these people, what does it feel like a woman, they can normally never point to anything other than stereotypes. And that's how we get back to, okay, so this is just regressive and talking about stereotypes. So the idea that it's a feeling, fine. If you want to say that you feel like a woman, fine. You go, I don't have an issue with people saying that. What I do have an issue with is people saying that feeling then grants them permission to access female spaces.
Well, Felice was sat in this chair a couple of weeks ago and we talked about this, and I think I've slung out some phrase that it's the bipartisan left-right horseshoe of female coddling. And I think you're seeing that emerging more and more, that the left, the progressives, if they buy into trans ideology, the only argument they have a lot of the time is, I feel like this, insert stereotype. Then actually, you see an emergence of this on the right as well, where women are pushed towards staying in the kitchen and making a sandwich because of the same stereotypes. So it feels like this sort of goes all the way round when you get to the extremes, no matter what side it's on.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Yeah, I agree.
Tell me more about university. And we've spoken a bit already about free speech and it being clamped down on. Do you feel like that's just absolutely baked into the system, in terms of not being able to disagree? Because before, a lot of people, I've sat in on a million different trans interviews or free speech interviews when I was producing Trigonometry. And the key thing that people always say is that before, it was encouraged to disagree with a teacher and have this robust discussion. Whereas now that doesn't seem to be the case, as you've already told me.
Well, interestingly, and I don't know whether this is the same at different universities, but there's a policy that says their trans inclusion policy for academia is that trans people will not be painted in a negative light, and that there'll always be like we need to respect trans people's lives, make sure they're presented in a positive light, to make sure we avoid transphobia and prejudice. But I don't understand what the scope of that means, because then that could mean that gender critical views as things that can't be expressed in academia at university. So in that sense, it is baked into policy, in my opinion, because if we're not allowed to paint any trans person in a negative light, that means we can't talk about the fact that 60% of trans women in prison are in there for sexual violence. I mean, that's not saying that all trans women are sexual predators, but it is a fact that 60% of trans women or men who identify as women in prison as of April 2019. It's on a paper that was submitted as evidence to a parliamentary committee. That is government data. So if we can't even talk about that, because that could be seen as painting trans people in a negative light, then we can't have proper discussions. So in that way, it is baked in, I would say, from my interpretation of the policy.
And to ask you frustrating questions, but to just keep on probing into this, what would you say to someone that just says, you know, I mean, I'm a man, I feel like a woman, I want to be a trans woman, I don't really feel a need to go into their changing rooms, I'll use the, you know, disabled toilets or gender neutral toilets or whatever, and I don't feel like I'm doing any harm. What's the big deal, really? Should they just be allowed to live, let live?
Of course. People can live their lives however they want, as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's rights. And I believe that women, well, according to the Equality Act, females and males have the right to exclude the opposite sex on the basis of privacy, where that's appropriate. So yeah, it doesn't bother me at all. And actually, I admire trans people who accept that they are different. And that means that when I say trans people, I mean trans women specifically, acknowledge that they are male. And that means that they shouldn't have access to female-only spaces because they wouldn't be female-only spaces. So yeah, I don't have an issue with that at all.
You say trans people, I'm guessing you're alluding to gender dysphoric people if you don't actually believe in trans ideology.
I struggle with this one because I don't believe in transgender ideology, and people often say, oh, these people don't even believe that trans people exist. Of course, I believe there are people who say that they're trans, but it's the equivalent of saying, if I say that I don't believe in God and there's someone sat in front of me who believes that they were created by God, does that mean I don't believe they exist? Like, it's the same thing to me. So in that sense, of course, trans people exist in the same way, of course, Christians exist. I just don't believe in their own idea of themselves. Of course, gender dysphoria is a real thing, but gender dysphoria doesn't always mean you might identify as trans, and certainly doesn't mean that you are the opposite sex and that you were born in the wrong body.
Well, just because something exists as a belief of who you are, it doesn't mean it's true. And to throw my hand into the mix and get cancelled along with you, have two fucking bigoted Gen Zers at the table, I just think, to me, it's obvious that men are men and women are women. I can't believe we're having this discussion. It pissed me off. But I feel like both sides do need to give a little bit. And it's all really caught up in this battle of language more than anything else. What gender actually means, what sex means. And I think that actually we could do with getting rid of the word gender altogether.
Oh, I agree. That's why the word gender critical is a thing, because in my opinion, to be a feminist is to be critical of gender. Like, I don't believe there is such thing as gender. It's as Jermaine Greer says, gender or femininity is the fake version of femaleness. So, you know, in that sense, I don't believe gender exists.
Well, I think you can feel a certain way that might pertain to commonalities with the other gender that sort of all women do typically have, but that doesn't make you a woman. It makes you feel like you have a lot in common with women, and that's the distinction. I mean, Sophie Spittle, she went on the Trigonometry podcast and she speaks about fitlings as the word, and it's this idea that it's how you fit in, it's how you feel, but it doesn't mean that you are that thing. And I think that's exactly what we need to have. We need to have sex. I'm a man or woman. And that's really what's important 99% of the time on your passport, what changing rooms you use, what sports you compete in, whatever. But then you have this concept of fitlings where, you know, I'm a male, but I have female fitlings. I feel like I fit in with women more and I share more of their traits than I do with men. Okay, cool. But that doesn't mean that you get to compete against them.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you're a woman.
Exactly.
I think in lots of ways I'm quite masculine, but that doesn't mean I'm a man. And that's the whole point. That's what feminism is trying to be moving away from. So why would anyone who feels they're slightly feminine or is really feminine, who is male, feel that that means that they're a woman? I mean, the other issue with this whole thing is that gender non-conforming children, overwhelmingly, they're 20 times more likely to grow up to be gay. We don't know why it is, but you know when you just see that little boy, and Helen Joyce talks about this, you can sort of see that little boy and you just know that he is probably going to grow up to be gay. He's flamboyant, he's a bit wishy, I think that's the word she uses. And so it's this gender ideology is specifically harmful to children who are going to grow up to be gay because they are the most gender non-conforming or most likely to be gender non-conforming. So in that way, it is the idea that LGB is paired up with the T is just so ridiculous because they are transing the gay away, like the LGB Alliance would say.
Well, that's what happens when you go about using these stereotypes, is that certain groups get caught in them and then transition, like gay people.
I mean, there's the evidence. I mean, Hannah Barnes's work on the Tavistock Clinic, the amount of reports there were from clinicians who would have parents come in with their kids who would openly be homophobic and say, oh, I just, I'm so glad that they're trans and not gay, because they would rather have a trans child than admit that their child is just gay. I mean, it's there to see on the table. I don't see how anyone, if you can say that you're a LGBT ally, well, you can't really be both, in my opinion. No.
What would you say to someone that says, just use my pronouns, my preferred pronouns, it's not that big of a deal?
See, I'm still not sure where I stand on this, because I understand that it's unnecessary to upset people. Like, it's not nice to upset people, and if that's really going to upset someone, then fine. But if we can't use the language to talk about the reality of things, then that's removing, like, another, to quote Helen Joyce again, rules are written in language. So as soon as you give the language away, you can't establish why it is that a male can't come into a female toilet. If you're referring to a trans woman, say, oh, but she can't come in here. What do you mean she can't come in here? But it's a she. Well, no, the reason she can't come in here is not because she's trans, it's because he's male. And so by taking the language away, you can't explain to someone clearly as to why, it doesn't make sense to say she is male. Maybe it does to some people, it doesn't to me, and it's not helpful.
Yeah, well, I think this ties into the whole fitling thing, and this is what I mean by maybe both sides have to give a bit of ground, because I wonder, and I haven't thought about this super deeply, but I wonder what would happen if you did give away pronouns, and you did let them be used by however they liked. Because if you get rid of the word gender and pronouns just describe your fitling, how you fit in, then suddenly actually they're not tied to anything. At the moment, if I want to be referred to as she and be called Ellie, then that means I have an inherent right to the female changing rooms. Whereas actually, if you sever the link between pronouns and sex and say that pronouns are just how you feel, then if I feel more feminine, you can call me she without giving me the right to go into female
and this
toilets.
used to be the case. So gay men have historically sort of had this thing where you call each other she. Because but they never claimed that they were women. But now it's turned into this thing that, for trans women especially, and it's much harder for a trans woman to pass as a woman than it is for a female who wants to identify as a man who's been taking testosterone, because testosterone is such a powerful drug. If you've already been under the influence of testosterone, it's almost impossible to reverse the effects. So the power of having the language is so important for trans women especially. And that, I made this point about Blair White. The reason why she, and I'll call her she for the sake of it, the reason why for her it's okay, I think, the reason why it's okay for her to say, yes, I know I'm a man, is because she passes so well. Whereas for trans women who don't, and everyone knows that you're male and wouldn't know other, and, it'd be hard to convince anyone otherwise, the power of having the language and making sure people refer to you as she is what they need to sort of, at least people are pretending to claim that they think I'm a woman. Whereas Blair, unless she pulls her pants down, you would never know that she was male unless you already know who she is. So it's, for her, it's fine to say, yeah, I'm a male, but walking around, it doesn't matter because people are just going to call her she.
It reminds me of these guys that pretend to be alpha males and they have to keep on saying that they're an alpha male and that they're the champ. It's like, who are you reminding?
Yeah, if you have to keep reminding people what your preferred pronouns are and what you think you are and what other people should refer to as, that's very telling of, there's a reason why this is so difficult to get around pronouns, because humans can recognize sex in an instant. Investigations and experiments have found that. So it is really confusing for a human to try and get their mind around the fact that you're obviously sat opposite a man, but they want to go by she, and that's because they want you to treat her as a woman, whatever that means.